At the core of this, John, I think what might be most interesting in the time we have is if we can share effectively if we can realize what is mutually of relevance, and there's a sense in which we live in some ways, dramatically different contexts, and in others, perhaps in deep ways, we meet in a shared context. And so there is a certain breadth and depth that I'm seeking. If I were to ask you the question, I'm curious, in the 6 years since we recorded our first podcast together, how you've reflected on or noticed the context of your work develop. I'm curious what has strengthened in you in relation to that. Of course, I'm sure there are, and I recognize deep continuities of effort. Of course there are. And at the same time, there have been unfoldings, evolutions. And I'm curious how you see those.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Let's maybe with the things that are sort of changing. And I think it's fair for me to say, at least in part, I would aspire to be it in total, but at least in part in response to, criticism and contact that I've had with others. But awakening from the meaning crisis was still very much in an individualistic frame. And I have realized the error of that and have moved increasingly into a dialogical frame that emphasizes collective intelligence over the individual intelligence of individual cognition. And that carries with it, of course, huge epistemological and ontological and existential changes, which I try to articulate in the follow-up series after Socrates. So that's one. I have moved from a position advocating for the religion that's not a religion, which is very much a top-down engineering project, to a very different bottom-up project, which I call the Philosophical Silk Road, which is an attempt to make myself personally, and even on pilgrimage, receptive and responsible to the advent of the sacred insofar as I possibly can. And so that has been a significant change for me. And the increasing apprehension and appreciation of ultimate reality as, in some sense, sacred. I did talk about this in Awakening the Meaning Crisis, but this has become much more pronounced, and it has ramified back into a whole bunch of practices, undertaken with people via the Vervaeke Foundation. I suppose another big shift for me has been an appreciation of this is going to sound like a Hallmark card, but there's no other way of saying it. An appreciation for my own ignorance. I genuinely think there's been some shifting towards an understanding of how much my earlier work contained error in it. And of course, in my earlier work, I criticized even earlier work, and I'm doing the same thing now. So in that sense, there's a continuity, but a sense of listening to all kinds of voices that I did not give that much attention to. In particular, theological voices. Theologians are now forming an increasingly large part of the material that I'm making my way through. Now, these are often very philosophical theologians. They're people who are on the border between philosophy and theology. But nevertheless, there's been a significant theological education, and part of that has been unfolding from the work itself, and part of that has been a response to the what looks like the possibility of the advent of AGI, which I think will shift our priorities and our theological concerns broadly construed and reformulated into a much more future-oriented orientation. But I still think theology is going to be a central study, field discipline, as our sense of who and what we are gets increasingly challenged by the possibility of autonomous AGI. So those are some of the biggest changes I would say have occurred for me.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, this feels a little bit too interesting not to ask, and then I'll return to sharing a little bit more about perhaps where I can meet you in that, and where some things and how some things have evolved for me over recent years. I'm curious how you would distinguish philosophy and theology now.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, part of the project, the Philosophical Silk Road, has made me sort of coin this term of religio philosophy, which is picking up on both meanings of the word religio, that as I use it, and religio as having to do with religious philosophy or philosophy religion. So for me, I guess the primary thing is theology is oriented as its primary and sustaining focus on ultimate reality, whether that is understood as a god or something else. And of course, philosophy will touch on that, and that's why there's significant overlap. And philosophy, I think, properly talks about being, etc. But philosophy doesn't have to be that, and I think philosophy is primarily oriented towards, well, modern philosophy is oriented towards knowledge. Ancient philosophy is oriented towards wisdom. And of course, both of those have important relationships with ultimate reality. But I think philosophy is a little bit more, this is too simplistic, but just to give it sort of, broad strokes, philosophy is a little bit more human oriented, and theology is a little bit more sacred oriented, divine oriented, ultimate oriented.
Yeah, right. If I had fleshed out the frame I was bringing in asking that question, I would have said something like, well, given to the degree that philosophy is unbound from relation to or care for ultimate reality, questions of profound significance, questions of ultimacy, then how could it be philosophy in some sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
nevertheless,
I think you're right. I do see them as interdependent, and this is why people like William Desmond, who explicitly situates himself on the between of philosophy and theology, are becoming increasingly important to me. I think you're right. I think they are interdependent. I would just say the terms maybe pragmatically refer to poles on a continuum, and I don't know. I'm not. I would have been at one time really, really concerned with clearly distinguishing them because of the way my own projects of identification were being taken up. But that's not the case for me now. That is simply just not the case for me. That concern has dropped away from me, and I'm glad for that. I'm glad for that.
yeah, no, I get that. Is part of the reason why that concern's dropped away from you, because of the deepening of your own relation to what therefore effectively binds them, which before we label it as discourse or some subject area with identities that study it, we're
Mm-hmm.
speaking about what is it to relate with, understand, be in dedication to, communicate about significance,
Mm-hmm.
ultimacy.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah. And so for me at that point, so many different discourses, so many different identities, or at least that play out in what become known as somewhat basely in some sense as language games,
Yeah,
right? You
yeah.
might say some discourse community, because of course we're not just talking about a language game, and yet nevertheless, whether it's this institutional context or that academic discourse, or perhaps even some other area of society that might not refer to itself in the context of language games, but nevertheless is presiding over, or in which you meet in the context of uncovering, realizing, knowing the nature of the human experience, sacredness, these types of things, which of course could happen in a home, in a family, in a community, in many, many different contexts. All of a sudden, it seems to be that the work or the relationship, the address, the treatment, the relating in whatever the context seems to be, in a sense, accountable to what then might be understood or reflected on or connoted in philosophy or theology in some sense. The point I'm making is just that you go deep enough and broad enough, and we, in a sense, return to a profound continuity with the here and now and what matters in terms of how we meet that. Now we can take a step back and be like, well, it turns out that this interaction we're having is embedded in systems, and actually there's all these different constraints and pressures, and maybe we've got differences in shared project and shared context, and of course all the complexity comes back in. But in some critical sense, what I'm hearing is quite natural and appropriate. And it's not, in a sense, to say, in a sense, you're distinguishing that. I was going to say something like, well, I'm not trying to say human first or humanity first or phenomenology first, but just, well, here we are participating in a sense first. Okay.
Yeah.
There we are. All right. We've returned. And I really do meet living a life in that way, and building in that context. And, and, philosophy for me is a term that is somewhere in there that's broad enough, deep enough, obscure enough, and in principle open enough to at least being able to name what it is to approach who we are, what are we doing, how can we collaborate together, or how far away do we need to keep from each other, and what are the various pitfalls with respect to coming closer and stepping further away with each other with respect to big patterns of nature and the nature of what we are and these types of things.
That's certainly the Platonic conception of philosophy, and that is one to which I still feel a profound allegiance. So,
okay, so what's occurring for me now is, as I was sort of alluding to before we started recording, there genuinely are maybe sort of probably between 10 and 20 conversations that I would be really interested to have, right? Like, for instance, I just want to communicate my deep interest to you in inquiring about the roots of how you've come to understand Platonic philosophy, Neoplatonism, but also in principle, how we might connect not only to that context, but what might have influenced it. Not because I'm coming from a scholarly perspective necessarily in terms of the history of discourse, although of course there were cultures and there was languages, but also because in some important sense, there's an always already and as well a living history of organism, ultimacy that we might appeal to or welcome in terms of understanding that. So that's there, and there's sort of like a very interesting scholarly aspect to that I think we cannot lose, and at the same time we cannot be distracted by the scholarly aspect.
Yeah.
In terms of how we actually meet it and address it and treat each other. And I've always seen that coming through in your work. So that's that. And now let me share what I feel might be potentially of most mutual relevance in terms of, let's say, some of the tensions that I've been grappling with, relating with, challenges I've come up against, and how they might situate with respect to the history of and unfolding of your project, various projects, of course, because I think there's something really relevant there. And I suppose it's in sharing, to the degree that you and I share a dedication, however we would go on to distinguish that, in a sense, it would be much easier to just leave it at that sentence, because certainly I'm not here to speak on behalf of your dedication, but I've always connected with the care you have for understanding the effort you put into a quality of communication, and what I see as you holding yourself to the highest standards you can in terms of teacherly authority, all these types of things, just to name a few. And
Well, if I could just interject for a
please.
sec, I mean, I just want to reciprocate. One of the things that I've always respected and had affection for you about is the very admirable care you take with language, and through which you very carefully try to achieve deeper understanding. You come into this, talking with you is very different. And I mean that as a compliment than many of the interviews and discussions I have. And I'm not slighting or insulting anybody either, but I feel with you that you and I share a deep concern to have an almost reverential relationship to the care at which we're speaking and the care with which we are listening. And so I welcome you. I appreciate you and welcome you recognizing that in me, but I think it's very appropriate that you allow me to recognize it in you as well.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that. As a slight detour, it ultimately does. It is going to return and connect back with the context I'm opening here. I came to a particularly clear reflection about some of my nature. It had been there roughly, but this was just a nice way of putting it in a sentence. I'd certainly, like for instance, recognizing I might have had issues with authority was something I was hearing a bit about at high school. So I've certainly been relating with that notion for a while. But there's something about the pursuit, let's say, of philosophy, of understanding, of meeting the academy, of relating with great thinkers, of relating with contemporaries. There is certainly of course, a spirit of seeking, but also a challenge that is often necessary in those contexts. It's certainly the case that, at least the story we tell ourselves, and I believe it to be true, which is that human understanding, or what we at least say we believe about the world, has changed over time. So there have been many successful challenges, although making successful challenges, in that sense, challenging authority, true authority, is not so straightforward. And in some important sense, navigating the tension and the difference associated with challenging authority or claims is like maybe one of the things, at some level, if you were being a little, maybe not careful, you could say we're worst at. And then at the same time, look at this remarkable civilization we are still a part of. So without, but then as the stakes get higher, does it matter if you just didn't quite figure it out? Like if you just got close, turned out that you were just radically wrong in some important sense. But I sort of reflected to myself, I've done this with a number of people over the years in various ways. I think many, many, many people do it. I sort of recognize one of the things that is hardest for people to meet in response is if some young person comes up and so bluntly, effectively communicates, hey, please, and often not even that, reveal to me the cracks in your foundations. Reveal to me the cracks in your foundations, hey. Like, who wants to actually, okay, all right, let me just open up here to the deep instability of my whole life and who I am and the institutions I'm a part of. And of course, institutions don't like to reveal their cracks. This is something I've certainly come up against in various ways. Now, just to return, if I can, to sort of presenting again where I feel a real generative tension has been for me, and perhaps how I see it potentially developing in the context of the philosophical Silk Road. I'm wondering if this is, and as you mentioned, moving to a more dialogical, you always had that, but you're emphasizing more of a dialogical approach to thinking and collective intelligence and these types of things. And that might come through if I put forward to you one of the calls you've made, and certainly you've showed up in supporting this in a very serious and effective way, I think, for many people, is a phrase you refer to as an ecology of practices. And
yes.
I won't say too much about, let's say, the embedding context that you mean that in. I'll open you to do that if you find it to be relevant. And I appreciate that. I think it's critical. There's ways I think about it with respect to its functionality. Certainly, it supports a kind of training of people to
Mm-hmm.
meet and address and become in their lives. We could say a number of other things. I've been thinking a lot and relating a lot and finding myself needing to use the language of the praxis of ecology
Mm-hmm.
to speak to what is for me oftentimes more prescient and critical in terms of the context of my life and work. And there are various important distinctions that I think are helpful to make in terms of maybe finding, articulating if there are important differences between these. And I think we need to recognize the importance of both is where I'm coming from. So that's one way I've thought about of sort of presenting some of the possibility of mutual, let's say, relevance realization with respect
Mm-hmm.
to shared project of effective, is dedication, to we language of ultimate significance. I'll stop there before opening up too much poetry in terms of what we might mean by that or what I can say about that.
So I'm there's a distinction here, and I heard you make the distinction, but I guess I want to know more about it because there was an inversion, and I know you're not just doing the silly Sartrean thing. Um, so, the ecology of praxis and a praxis of ecology. And I take
Right.
it that the difference is something like I'm presuming the notion of ecology and grounding practice in it, and you're inverting it and saying, no, 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 maybe it should be the other way around. And you not exclusively, you made that clear, but maybe
Yeah.
you should consider know that it's that ecology also needs to be grounded in practice. That ecology isn't necessarily the more substantial notion in which the other one resides. Did I understand you correctly, or did I
I
misunderstand?
think I didn't give too much. I think you're orienting in the right direction. So I've been distinguishing between practice and praxis with an X.
Yes, yes.
Now, I don't know if you would accept this, but in terms of praxis with an X, we can be a bit more rich about it, but I might practice to play the football game on the weekend, but there's something distinct about the training sessions and then the match itself. But the praxis of participation, in that sense, the undergoing of the participation is, it cannot ultimately be contained by whatever is the
Mhm.
holding of training. There's a radicality of life and risk.
Yeah, yeah.
And in that sense, ecology as such, the real meeting in that second person transmembranic, I like this language. I think second person transmembranic, ecology, life world, all
Mm.
those things for me map to the same sort of domain for this purposes, or at least the same. And I do think about that relationally. And if I was to include some of your language, I'm thinking that's where transjectivity sits,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And
Well,
so,
that's what was coming to mind for me. Your use of praxis was where I was thinking, oh, but this is the idea of the fundamental inaction and embodiment and embedment that from which the agent arena polarity and co-determination emerges, and then any specific ecology of practices sits within that. But that deeper praxis, to use your language, of course, is enmeshed in a more comprehensive kind of ontological, obviously psychological, sociological, cultural, and biological ecology. And now that's how I was hearing what you were saying. And if that's the case, then what I can say is I want to make something very clear that although I was talking about a lot of these new things, one of the things that has been is ongoing and deepening perhaps in the dialogue with these new things is my participation in, my development in, my work in for ecog sci. I just was co-author on a major paper that's going to be published, and so that work is ongoing. And for me, um, that's where I turn to those concerns. I think you're putting your finger on, and and they properly have a philosophical dimension. But yes, what is it? I mean, what is it that makes us the kinds of beings such that we can, Hegel's idea that we're not just natural, we're spiritual, and that we come into normativity, and we have this interesting relationship to it. It's somehow beyond us objectively, but we subjectively identify with it, or it's not really normative for us. It's just force, right? But there's this sense of like, how is it that we find ourselves identifying with and yet being responsible to these systems of normativity, and how do they emerge out of uh, our biopsychosocial, ecological existence? And this question of has that. See, I didn't make that clear. That part of my work, which is already running through Awakening to the Meaning Crisis, that part of my work has also continued to deepen and develop as I've tried to get clearer and clearer about, well, I'm working on a book with Dan Chiappe, what we call the being of rationality and the rationality of being. How do those properly, how can we understand them properly together? And so if I've understood you correctly, this is where I am doing the work I'm trying to get at like, yeah, what is the underlying praxis? What is the underlying way in which we take up agency and we find the world to be an arena? And for me, that has become a progressively deeper question. I sort of presupposed it earlier on, and I was just sort of agent, arena, co-determination, and you have Gertz and you have all this stuff and niche construction, and that's all there. But it's like, no. There's a deeper issue here, because there's a normative dimension to this, and right, that has to be understood. And I take it because my understanding also of the word praxis is that it also differs from other terms in that it connotes there's a normative dimension to what is being discussed here, that people are committing to and belonging to some domain of normativity. So that's how I would now respond to you.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And so part of my motivation in bringing this up, again, I could delve into responding to you and inquiring into the work you're doing in the context of 4E cognitive science, and effectively how that might connect with the theology you're reading with respect to the ultimacy of how we participate in the possibility of coherence itself. I mean, participate in transformation. I remember once many years ago, I spoke to you about how I think in terms of the modes of orientation as sort of base, you can get a grip on them phenomenologically, the fundamental constituents of relating with identity and its transformation itself. I mean, very influenced by Whitehead and various things. So just pointing to, in some sense, language that supports a, really, really up and down in a deep way what participating in the very roots of our belonging in relation to creativity and possibility is, and something like that. And so I'm of course recognizing that you take the thinking and the investigation and the inner inquiry of the praxis of ecology seriously. So I'm hearing you on that. Now I'm ultimately wanting to identify something a bit more, a tiny bit more precise as a domain of inquiry, which I haven't spoken to yet, although we've alluded to it earlier on in the context of authority and appropriate authority.
Yeah.
And I'm wanting to ground this in the context of our understanding of a shared significance, shared project, shared building in the world. And so when I think about an ecology of practices, I think that is likely to eventuate in the kind of, maybe it doesn't have to, but it's likely to eventuate with a basis of authority that is a kind of third person, institutional. It's an authority by training. These are paths that have been walked before to some degree, and even though your participation on them might necessarily be unique, nevertheless, There's a language of training and
Yep.
guidance and teacherly transmission that can support people into cultivating skills
Hmm.
and capacities to relate with being and each other and the world. And all of that is absolutely essential, absolutely essential. And I'm wanting to see it at the same level of importance in terms of our cultural and communal and functioning, as anything else I'm about to talk about. Now, in terms of the authority which comes to select or cultivate what might then be taught in an ecology of practices,
Hmm.
that the authority for that is not coming necessarily from exactly the same place, the same mode. And that's what perhaps in principle, the praxis of ecology as a domain is pointing to, not saying it should be named that. And I like the way you're
Yeah.
going at it in terms of an inquiry into what's really at play in how we meet fundamentality, let's say, or participate in that. But I would see the authority, and I don't know about the wording of this, but the authority that comes from that immediately relational inquiry. It's there, like there's a kind of authority by, in terms of what then influences the ecology of practices, the third person, as a kind of authority by formation of valuation is what I wrote down in a notebook a month ago when I was preparing for this. Now I really want to be careful and really open up the phraseology of that. But it
Hmm.
seems like to the degree that then the ecology of practices, has selected for pathways, then we're undergoing a process which is wanting to be capable of reattuning and
Right.
really sharing from a base of understanding, value, not to say it has to be final and complete. One other domain, I'll speak to this very quickly and give you room to respond, is just that I see that obviously the second and third person in relation also to the first. And that first person might be, I would see that more as the domain of the transcendent in some sense, where I would mean that quite specifically um, as that really unique encounter of, I don't want to be quick about defining this, but there's something of the ending of the trance. I really like the wordplay Lawrence Curry Clark uses on that. The ending of the trance, in that sense,
Hmm.
it might be that first contact I have with the cracks in the foundation of the institution, of the
Hmm.
third person authority, because in some sense I'm open to receiving that which is beyond that previous containing logos, that previous containing normativity as symbolically represented and instantiated in ritual, because maybe I'm recognizing, there's vitality here that is beyond that, right? And
Hmm.
now I bring that in to second person relating, and it's messy all of a sudden, and it's messy, and the institution might not want to hear it, and sometimes it can be wild and off piece in a really important way, that really come back to the path a little bit here. Maybe you've got a few bits and bobs to share, but actually you're taking off in some directions which we have been not that helpful, all the rest of it. So these are kind of thinking the basis of first, second, and third person authority. And I'm really
Yeah.
interested in the relationships between these with respect to shared projects of really everything we're speaking about.
Extremely pertinent and germane. I'll start sort of more abstractly, theoretically, but then I'll move more personally, existentially, because this question about authority should never be spoken of in a purely abstract way. That would be disingenuous. Um, but the idea of the collective practices like philosophical fellowship and dialectic into dialogos is to give people a participatory knowledge, a participatory knowing of the logos, the Geist, not the abstract reflection on, but the actual experiential participation in the collective intelligence generating new intelligibility, new ways of seeing and being. And then that Geist logos is itself an imaginal presencing of the possibilities that you're indicating, that the logos is always situated within an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, and that we have our proper relationship to that is and this is a sort of a Neoplatonic thing. This is an ongoing receptivity, and the idea behind that is that is to serve as the second person dimension by which there is a co-creation of a new sense of being in contact with reality that is normative for people, and an intelligibility that's shareable. Because I take the Hegelian argument, the Wittgensteinian argument, that normativity requires intelligibility. It has to be, we have to, for something to be normative, we have to be able to reciprocally recognize each other. I have to be able to give you the right, and you have to be able to demand from me a responsibility, etc. All that, I won't unpack all of that, but that reciprocal recognition at the heart of it. But you want reciprocal recognition to be like, you want it to be a profound reciprocal opening if it's going to be something that is porous to ultimacy, and where ultimacy is not never anything that is claimed, but is always the understanding that whatever we have, even a moment of ecstatic, insight and reformulation of how we're finding things relevant, what you call the formation of valuation, that itself is right, is imaginal in nature. It's not final. It's not complete. It is caught. It is metaxu. It is caught between our finitude that we're bound into and our openness to transcendence in a powerful way. And what that then means for me personally is I have been, with the help of the Vervaeke Foundation, I have been pivoting, and we're doing some actual major structural transformation in which I am trying to move off the role of being the leader or the figurehead. And we're going to, for example, that's going to mean things like we're going to slowly, over the next couple of months, we're going to wrap up Voices with Vervaeke. We're going to reduce the number of sort of video I'm releasing, and I'm going to shift into a role that I think is proper, where I replace myself in the role of being a teacher, and that I don't have followers, I don't have fans, I don't even have members of a community. I have students, and what I'm going to do is help them to study, because I think the temptation to reify not only into, as you're saying, foundational structures, but to reify and project onto specific persons is endemic right now. And I would like very much to not do that. And so trying to get a deeper and fuller participation in the logos, and the logos as, like I said, the presencing of the perspective of ultimacy as an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, and that my role of that is I'm not the guardian, the gatekeeper, the prophet, or any of that. I am over here, and I am doing my best to teach people such that they can recognize how that's showing up in each other, and recognize how it's showing up beyond each one of them and beyond all of them as a group, and hopefully help them get that attunement you were talking about. So this, I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on, but I'm this question of authority, and I have, here's where the influence of Zach Stein on me is. I have acknowledged, Gadamer and Hegel's and 1,000 other arguments, Plato, that you can't be without authority. But the authority that I think is virtuous for me is teacherly authority, and I want to clearly move to that and do what I can as a teacher, as as a scientific and philosophical teacher, to help people to become more into participation in finding the authority as an ongoing dynamic dialogue between their finitude and their transcendence. And this is the Platonic argument for me, that simultaneously holding on to our finitude and our transcendence is absolutely crucial. This is Drew Hyland's point. If we just hold on to our finitude, we fall into despair and servitude. If we just hold on to our transcendence, we fall into hubris and tyranny. But if we hold on to the two together, we can avoid those two, and that this is the best chance we have of authority showing up virtuously for us. So that's a sort of a long speech. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to give a speech,
Not at
but
all.
that question is, you can see it's profoundly engaging me and activating me in the good sense of the word activate, because I think it is a paramount question. And I've been participating, touring with other people, observing other people, and I don't mean in some conspiratorial, condemning fashion. I've just been trying to watch how people are wrestling with this in a lot of the emerging things that are happening around the advent of the sacred, because that's what I think those two are bound up together. As the sacred is advented, the idea, the realization that new forms of authority will become available, I think is absolutely correct. But the possibilities for the recognition of the advent of new forms of authority being subject to manipulation and inappropriate ownership and all kinds of stuff is paramount and pronounced. So I'll be quiet because I want to hear what you have to say about that.
No, brilliant. Thank you, John. Yeah, and first of all, and I think we do need to see through our concrete enacting and lived tensions of relating with this. I mean, that's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
While at the same time, I do think, I'm not here to sort of shine a light on your context only. Do you know what I mean? That's not the intention. It's just that there is a reality of shared project in this case, which allows us to actually ground the exploration, not so much exploration, but the attempt to really wrestle with and understand, let's say, that which was initially expressed in a more abstract sense and might come across to that way for people when we talk about the relationship between finitude and transcendence. And this has been fundamental to how I've attempted to articulate various things in the voicecraft context, for people who meet it for the first time, or to larger groups of people who might be meeting it for the first time. And I've never used that framing so tightly, but certainly one of the things I've recognized is that, but you could even just think about it in terms of friendship. When someone comes along and meets someone and maybe feels in some important sense like they've been seen a bit more than usual, and they've been absent that, then the affordance of that and the sense of enriched potential for life, living together, creating together in a way that's in more alignment, is of course there, and it's beautiful. And it's that glimpse in some sense of, you might say, a transcendence, which has then here grounded in relationship, a real concretion in, well, here we are, right? But then it turns out, oh, well, I can only see you on Tuesdays, or only once a month, right? Or once every 3 months. And it turns out, there's this one particular relationship is impotent with respect to meeting all your needs. Of course, there's a whole ecology. There's a whole praxis of ecology. And here we are embedded in culture, the social world, and all these different types of things. And so I am not wanting to lose the abstraction that allows us to speak about economics and incentive and the immense entanglement of our participating in system, which has tremendous effects on what's possible to actually support in that context of mutually enriching relationship, where we're also factoring in a relationship with finitude, right? Obviously, we get sick and stuff, and it ain't always necessarily enriching. We get knocked, and then we, okay, so maybe we can learn some things from that, and in that way enrich it. But certainly, that relationship between finitude and transcendence is super important.
I think it's absolutely central. I mean, I think our culture has lost that tonos. I don't like to use the English word tension because it only has a negative connotation. But the way Heraclitus talks about the tonos of the bow or the tonos of the lyre, we've lost that tonos of holding those two, so that they are constantly, what I would call doing opponent processing with each other. And I think we careen between despair and tyranny, and hubris and humiliation. And I think we've lost the tonos. And I think part of that, if you'll allow me to go back to, like you said, the praxis of ecology, is I've been trying to recover the notion, not the notion. I'm trying to recover the practice and the praxis of fellowship as something other than friendship, something other than citizenship, something other than an economic transactional relationship, but something, right, that has this function of like being the dialogical community whereby we endeavor to have the common project of maintaining our commitment to this tonos that I think is the defining engine of our humanity, the virtual engine, as I would say.
Yeah, beautiful. And I, it's funny because, maybe for the purpose of our conversation, then I'm happy to use the word fellowship. Although perhaps if I use friendship, perhaps if you could read through my appreciation for and agreement with the value you're pointing to in the notion of fellowship, and likewise with the words tonos.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, perhaps for reasons of third person authority, many contexts in which I might speak in, the terms fellowship and tonos aren't necessarily within the poetic license I might have,
Yeah, yeah,
right, to speak
yes.
to some of these notions, and that's super key. This really becomes super key when we encounter, in a sense, somewhere closer to the language of blood and guts is coming at me, sort of just colloquially to have some fun. The blood and guts of ecology. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? There's just little pockets of openness to poetry with language where that can be understood as a real participation with sort of creative possibility in opening us up to contact and knowing of reality and what have you. I think poetry is critical, fundamental to philosophy.
Oh, I think so. I think a proper recovery in Tolkien's sense of the word recovery of poetry is absolutely essential right now. I think the poetry reminds us of the indispensability and the pervasiveness of our of our entwining with the imaginal, and that it is absolutely. This is part of the argument I've been building about how at the heart of the rational is the imaginal, and in the heart of the imaginal is the rational, and the relationship between poetry and philosophy, this ancient relationship that Plato condemned, but then went on to exemplify in a completely interesting fashion. I think this is part and parcel of a fellowship. Part of what makes a fellowship, think of the Fellowship of the Ring. What do they do? They share poetry because they're trying to articulate, right? They're trying to articulate a common way in which they're situating themselves between finitude and transcendence and holding them together, and thereby holding each other together in how they are holding those things together. And so I think you're concerned with poetry. I mean, of course, this goes back, ancient, but Heidegger really brought it back into forefront. But I think that's absolutely part and parcel of this. Poetry is right on that place where the inexhaustibleness of intelligibility comes into intelligibility, and we are remembering in the act of poesis that the intelligibility comes from something that is inexhaustible. And it's when we forget the poetry and we fall into prose, especially sort of pedantic prose, that we come to think of these terms as somehow, well, how they're thought of in computational formal systems, as completely self-sustaining and self-existent. And that is, I think, a fundamental mistake.
Right. And yeah, I absolutely agreed. And I think this points to one of the failure tendencies of the engorged third person institutional context, that formalization, that symbolic
Yeah.
order. All the things have been said. Hey, no more space for new ideas in
The
philosophy or
glass
something like
bead
that.
game, right? That's Hermann Hesse's
Right.
famous metaphor. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And thank God for that. And it's been so heartening for me and such a source of grounding and a real source of relief and confidence. It's been a real source of, I think, appropriate authority for me with respect to how I can trust myself to add value to context of dialogue, group contexts of fellowship and navigating the tonos and all of that. is because of that relationship, is because of that entrance of the inexhaustibility of the intelligibility in precisely that way, because
Yeah.
there's always someone who can speak what is theirs to speak in that moment. There's always something to bring in that adds value. And there's always a new form of contribution. And people can say it might rhyme and this and that. Well, of course, in some sense, we're talking about poetry, so you might have a bit of rhyme in there, metaphorically, but it genuinely does something. It unveils, it supports, it strengthens, it opens that shared space for relationship, understanding, perception of beauty, and all of that. And so the remembering of the quality of opening to receive that contribution becomes a profound way to resource the authority of that second person field in some sense. And so that's been one of the key ways I've been trying to
Well said.
invite participation in. I'll share this with you in a couple of weeks' time. I don't know if I'll share it publicly. I just filmed the opening to a live event that Voicecraft held, and one of the core messages was simply the importance of reception, its criticality to expression. I mean, very, very obvious things in some sense, but things, of course, in the cultural discourse and general societal chatter that have been totally lost. Hey, who really wants to receive what the other person's saying?
Yeah.
So it's madness. But so look, we're totally aligned on this, and I suppose again, if I'm just, and I know I'm sort of taking up a little bit here to move this in a direction, it's just because of the limitations of our time. So now we've got some of these pieces sort of laid out. I think it does become quite interesting for you and I, and perhaps yourself, and let's say the reality of the difference in the affordance landscape, and in any way kind of relation or embedding in the institutional system as we meet the context of capitalism, attentionalism, which we can speak about, how we meet that differently, and how I've met that now as a 32-year-old man turning 33 in October on this journey for a long time now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Made it. Yeah. Made it also, still early 30s now. I appreciate that. But, obviously I'm undergoing particular pressures, particular tensions associated with that
Yeah.
when it comes to the possibility for family, when it comes to, particularly when I was
Yes.
younger, what it maybe looks like for me to fit the box of, trustworthy in many ways, in terms of like, well, why invite this person to speak at this place? What's their affiliation?
Yep. Yep.
All these types of things, and how, and the way that I and others like me and together we're sort of meeting this context, wanting to stay in deep, real dedication to the cultivation and the strengthening of quality contexts to support, we could just say, dialogical transformation, participation in real relationship, fellowship, these types of things, wanting to ground that in the economic world, right, as well, obviously. Taking all the things, trying to be open to take all the things that might be important seriously, despite the fact that the level of power to actually relate with them, well, obviously, in some sense, it's absurd. And yet, nevertheless, to shut your eyes to it, to close and turn away from it, I think would be very foolish.
Yeah.
And so it's partly that, it's that I find myself, John, I'm sort of in probably like quite some, even though we could relate at a deep level about it, the concretion of the mess of the second person praxis of ecology that I meet in the context of wanting to be in dedication and service to much of what we're speaking about, is tremendously different. And I think there's a wild amount of value in there in terms of actually what's necessary to understand to support the broader cultural effort that I've always seen us as being in mutual relationship to. And I have found that I have just sensed there's been a widening distance a little bit between myself, maybe a few others like me, and some of the generation or a couple generations older, who are entering the context of attentionalism, institutional situation, capitalism in a very different concrete position, such that even those who they meet to collaborate with in those contexts, they may or may not have come through a similar pathway, let's say to yourself or myself. It could be radically different. There's places that I can orient myself to be of value and of service to projects that can take place at a particular level of authority without necessarily having really suffered for and spent the time on the, let's say, maybe if we could make a pivot, traveling the Silk Road as much. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and some of those people, and I'm speaking vague here, and it's not about anyone in particular, they don't necessarily know how to relate with someone like me. And there's interest, there's just, I'm just open, I'm pointing to like various tensions here where what becomes of like practical necessity to relate with in the context of the praxis really becomes very messy in the attempt to, let's say, add value to contexts for sharing understanding. There's a lot of things that get in the way, essentially inappropriate authority, in my opinion, determining what's welcome to presence in that context of shared meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. Very powerful. This is very probative. I think anybody who is properly committed, eventually I want to talk to you about how I'm not committed just to Neoplatonism, but to Zen Neoplatonism. But anybody who's properly committed to the Socratic, Platonic, Neoplatonic way, the dialogical way, if it should be a touchstone that I want to say this very carefully. If I came to a place where I couldn't enter into the kind of rich dialogos I'm having with you right now, I would take that as a touchstone that something has gone wrong, precisely because I think you have virtuously and with considerable virtuosity placed yourself, like you said, on the messy place, the interface, where the inexhaustible comes in to dialogical praxis and then perhaps into systems of practices. And I have endeavored to try to talk to many people who are more in the trenches, because I don't want to, well, like I said, I mean, it sounds selfish, and I don't mean it to sound instrumental. It's not like that. It's a proper regard and a proper respect. But it would be a touchstone for me that something's going radically wrong if I could not enter into a mutually generative, probative, exploratory, challenging discourse like we're having right now. And I would actually put that out to anybody who puts themselves as any kind of authority for the dialogical reception of the advent of the sacred, if they cannot properly enter into people who have demonstrated virtue in the mess, if I can use some of your language, the messiness, then I think that they need to reconsider their positioning. Now, of course, there's all kinds of practicalities here, which is part of the mess you're pointing to. Like, I can't talk to everybody. That's ridiculous. And I'm actually moving towards a kind of retirement in which I'm trying to, I'm trying to spend myself less in the world to some degree. And you also have to understand that I get approached by all kinds of people who want to enter into relationships with me that it's clearly I should not reciprocate that request, because there's all kinds of other things going on that, and I don't mean they're necessarily hostile. They in fact, some of the worst of this is people who come to me and they're treating me like the salvation for their world. And I don't want to take on that role, but I don't want to I don't want to seem like I'm condemning of people either. And so that's a very tricky balance. And I don't want to get too far astream. So that's just a context I'm putting around the main point I'm trying to make is, I think it's important that people who may, although you may not, I don't think people should just feel entitled, and you don't. But I think we need to have a way, I'm trying to propose something concrete here, of recognizing the authority in this touchstone manner of people who may not have gone through the traditional organizational pathway, but have nevertheless demonstrated ongoing virtue and virtuosity in being on the messy horizon of the dialogical in relationship to the inexhaustible. And I think, I don't know if that's the response you were thinking of, but that's the response that comes to mind to me, is that, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you right now. And I really liked the way you opened this up in such a probative manner around this. I think there is a temptation to get caught up in the spotlight in such a way that you forget the people not in the audience, but you forget the people that are outside the theater, acting as, the courtyard by which people come in and out, if you'll allow me to extend the metaphor. And there's an important responsibility here, and how that's going to work out concretely. I mean, we can do it one-on-one. I'm doing it now with you, but how we can do that collectively, responsibly, I think we're not talking about it enough. So that's where it comes to for me.
No, beautiful, John. Thank you, and I appreciate that. And clearly, on the personal level, in the various ways you indicated, what is and is not appropriate and possible for your energetic being in this life to relate with, that must be respected, right? And that I do respect. And I've shared very similar conversations with various people who express, and I find myself expressing the same sort of thing too, right? So that is, for me, to the degree we're wanting to actually stay in a process of helping each other see and seeing together, then that's table stakes. And so I receive that, and I hear you. You know, again, probably more what I'm, in a sense, what I'm not in an instrumental way, in a way that is literally, in some sense, the reality of our instruments coming together. As I say that,
that's nice. That sounds like a concert, and that's nice. That's a nice metaphor.
The reality of it sort of just does eventuate pointing to these personal situations as they in fact are relating to what I'm putting forward as, no, this is on the pulse actually of philosophy. I'm saying this is on the pulse of philosophy. Yeah. And like this is a significant, and it's in relation to these types of tensions that I find so much of the philosophical writing, or writing in general, that I want to do. When I do it, very rare, I don't feel like I have the space, in the economic possibility, really, to engage in it like I would like. I hope that comes at some point. I communicate these things to people, certainly, all the time, and I'm in relationship to people who help me understand, and they share things, all of that. There's so much of that. But in a sense, here we are recording something. And so it's this navigating this dance between the broadcast element, our remembrance of the praxis, and kind of what I'm pointing to is like, and it's not about, hey, give us the answer. I'm not coming at it with that energy. Like, I'm recognizing the outrageous significance of this, because in my opinion, and look, I attempted to move in an abstract way to some of this tension, the tonos, the generative tension of this with Zach Stein. I'll be doing it with a number of others. It's been present in some of the, dialogic collaboration. And, it would be fair to say a bit of a critique in the sense of, pay attention to this, that I've also offered to Forrest over a number of years, Forrest Landry. It's also what comes through in, relating with the relationship between content and context.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested in, I find it very significant that the praxis of transmission is often what is most shadowed in the project of sharing, whether it's story or philosophy or ideas that might help us address, let's say, the meta crisis, or help us in this great epochal moment of humanity. And it's not as though writing books and sharing content isn't absolutely critical. And of course, itself often comes as a result of profound engagement, maybe dialogically or in the mess of an individual's life. But it does seem to me that we are suffering for a lack of the actual medium for exchange itself, which is in some sense what I was getting in the conversation we had with Terry, almost like I'm sort of, I'm pointing to a problem that we are not yet even equipped to properly address in some important sense. And yet the profundity of it is that its home is in the here and now. Its home is in that fundamentality of how we participate in the formation of value together. And that's what makes it so remarkable, because and this is why it becomes a tremendous challenge to seek appropriate collaboration, let's call it, with various institutional contexts, because it seems to me that what is most in need of, what can most revitalize them is almost by definition going to appear as that which is coming a little too strong with the, by the way, have you noticed the cracks in your foundations? Or could you share them with me? It's like, well, look, we were hoping for something that was going to help us, transform, but more or less keep things the same,
Yeah.
And so that's wild. It's super wild. And, I don't think we need to, can consider it again within the remit or the context of an individual to respond to. And so we're pointing at something that is itself a self, evolving, real, field that communicates an affordance, and it has an affordance in it for the cultivation of understanding and distributed intelligence, all of this. And nevertheless, there's something of the naming of, or the pointing to some of these tensions between these domains, third person, second person, first person, in the context of authority. You don't want to skip the step to provisioning an ecology of practices if you're bypassing the praxis of ecology in your imminent life. That is not, I'm using language that you use. This is where I'm not putting that towards you. I just want to be clear. This is where I'm using that to look towards the bigger picture.
Because I think it's right. And this is a problem that we're really wrestling with, because in order to avoid inappropriate status, inappropriate authority around me and other things, we have made it clear we are not doing two things. There are two things we are not doing. We are not doing therapy, and we are not building community.
I say the same thing, although I like to give, just so you know, although how you color those becomes super important, because of course there is, and you use this, of course there's a common unity of interest. In the voicecraft context, like thinking about base camp rather than home base, if you find that helpful.
Yeah, well, we use, because I'm a martial artist, we use the dojo. The dojo isn't a community, right? It's not a community center, but it's a place where people practice so they can be better participants in a community, things like that. The various metaphors are important right now because we don't want to get too locked down too fast. But So the way I've tried to deal with this is to make clear what my role is not, but to, like what we're doing right now, to try to speak to this dimension in my work as much as I can, especially my scientific work, because I think, I feel that I'm still fighting, although I have many, many allies with whom I'm in fellowship, but fighting this individualistic, monadic notion of the individual and cognition and all that sort of thing. Because to my mind, if that isn't properly, if I don't put enough, if we don't put enough cracks in that foundation, everything we're talking about here is just going to get paved over and by that machinery of like the Cartesian framework. I'm not saying everybody should parse it out the way I have, but that's how I've tried to parse it out. I've tried to say, look, I've got to be responsible to these concerns, but if I'm responsible in the wrong way, it'll undermine my concerns about taking on the wrong kind of authority, the wrong kind of status. And so I don't even know if this is the right answer, Tim. Like, you can see, look what my hands are doing. But this is, this is my best reflective account while talking to all these people that I've bound to me to hold me to a virtuous path and a virtuous orientation. This is the best I've come to about trying to answer that terrific challenge. I don't know. I'm not pronouncing and saying everybody should do that. I'm just saying that. What am I saying? I'm saying I hear you. I hear what you're saying, and I indicate that indeed, as we used to say, meaning that there's actions I have taken to try and address the concern you're raising, and for which I bear direct personal individual responsibility. And I hope I'm sure I'm not claiming this is anywhere near sufficient, but
Yes.
this is what I'm doing to try and address the concern you raised, because I think it's absolutely pivotal. And we're all, if we are genuinely oriented towards two things, that I think there's a genuine advent coming here. And like Schellenberg and others argue, we are radically spiritually immature. We have to understand that we are in very, profound ways groping, and we can either do that, with some finesse and some reflection, or we can pretend we're not groping, in which case we become undeniably clumsy and destructive. So,
yes, I hear you. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, and I have always and continue to have a profound respect for the way in which you bring yourself and commit yourself to the very process that at some level is playing out here, which of course you speak about very often in terms of participating in self-correction.
I
Not
think
that I'm
genuine
holding you to
dialogos.
self-correction. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, I think genuine dialogos is happening here right now, and for me, I have no other proper response than reverence for it, and I cannot see any other proper response than reverence for it. Right, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying these things because I just want to be clear, because people may be miscontextualizing this. I do not feel, I'm speaking to anybody listening, I do not feel that Tim is putting me on the defensive. I'm not speaking defensively. I'm speaking responsively. I'm trying to say that I take what Tim says seriously. And because of that, I'm trying to show that this is not something that comes out from me in just words or policies, but this comes out in the very guts of how I am trying to deal with my identity formation in the world and my agency. Right. That's what's going on here.
Right. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a profound service, because there are very few people who, at least in the context of in a sense, the depth of challenge that I'm speaking to, I'm doing so to point out fundamental problems with relating to significance and ultimacy in the context of human life and culture. So, that's the ridiculous thing, and yet that's what precisely is called for in the very context of your work. It's certainly a path. Again, I spoke about that earlier as being necessary for philosophy, and so in a sense, it is a natural waypoint of dialogos to grapple with some of the dynamics we're speaking about, which isn't to say this needs to be a mark of every dialogos, but it is simply there in the territory, right?
It has to be. Not only is it a pertinent problem, Tim, it's a perennial problem. Socrates is wrestling with this when he's condemning writing, because he's concerned that writing will do a lot of the stuff we're worried about here. Right. But the irony is, of course, we wouldn't have Socrates' words if they had not been put into writing. And so that tension is right there, right at the inception of what became, Western philosophy. And so I agree with you. It's a terrifically pertinent problem because of social media, because of this medium that we're in right now. But it is also a profoundly perennial problem. That's what makes it an almost mythological problem in the non-pejorative sense of the word mythological. It's like a mythological problem because it reaches into being a perennial problem, and yet it's so pressingly pertinent. And so we're almost, we're almost being thrown back on sort of a mythology. When you're getting into mythology, you're being put back into your deepest, most fundamental resources to try and meet these kinds of problems.
Right.
And that again, by the way, that again speaks to the point about poiesis, right? When you're dealing with these kinds of perennial pertinent problems and you're moving into, I hope people are understanding this properly, a mythological dimension, poiesis has to be present with your philosophy, or you're not properly acknowledging the standpoint from which you are speaking.
And you didn't use the word theology, but it seems to me that's an appropriate framing here as well, in some sense. If we're talking about relating with the nature of authority, and appropriate authorship authority is that poiesis. Of course, we're relating with that.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I just want to thank you for that. That's exactly right. And you see why all of this and the way you have threaded this, the way the idea of theology naturally coming up, that speaks well of how you have been participating in this. I mean, that like, you see what I mean? But look at the work we had to do. But I'm praising you for it. Like, all that work had to be done so that the introduction of theology didn't sound awkward or inappropriate or some sort of polite conversation over a coffee table. This was like, no. Do you see how the natural, and I'm trying to read so much into that term, the natural next move is theology, right? But all the work we had to do in order for that to be, oh, of course.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Sorry for interjecting, but I just thought that was an important
point. No, not at all.
point.
No, that's fantastic. So there's a movement here, and again, I'm going to have to, wave farewell briefly to the possibility of inquiring, of speaking to naturalism, ecology, metaphysics, mind, these types of things. These are much more entertaining. Not much more entertaining. They're closer towards the entertainment over a coffee table value for me than some of this stuff, which isn't to say they're not important. They're super critical, and they do come back and fold back in. Nevertheless, as we move towards sort of what would be the last sort of last chapter or so of our dialogue today,
which I've really loved, by the way. This has been really, thank you. I've really loved this.
Well, I appreciate that, John. I really appreciate you sharing the time. I do know that there's a tremendous calling on your time. You take on a lot of work. Yes. And so now, in the context then of where we've presenced theology, I would also then share a little bit, or just point to, and a lot of what I'm doing here as well is pointing, a lot of this context, I'm sort of pointing to it, and I'm sort of saying to you, hey, it's possible if we were to speak again, publicly or privately, there's plenty to zoom in on that have been the formations of the real encounter of relating with a lot of this stuff. Do you know what I mean? There's a rich history of it, which I think is valuable to exchange. Nevertheless, one of the parts where our work also, I think, converges in an important way is perhaps in a sense responding to the plight of theological participation in our time.
Yes.
And, some people might see that at another level in terms of the fractious and contentious pluralism, many different religions, right? Many different identity formations, tremendous uncertainty in essentially all of them at some exoteric level at the very least, and how they relate to technology and even other cultures who they might not have encountered, just so much. And you mentioned the philosophical Silk Road. Now, something in the context of voicecraft and how I've identified paths forward for myself and others in the context of voicecraft is as something of a there's a shamanic role, if there's, there is in a sense a community cultivating among those who are acknowledging the particular way in which the shamanic sensibility might participate in that. The shaman might know in some sense they're between multiple places.
Mm-hmm.
There is nevertheless a community to base camp, and it does seem to require collective effort to tend a field and support context for understanding in these types of things. And of course, in the context of the Silk Road, you have different aspects to the journey. You have different encounters you might have with different spiritual practices, but also economic and civic contexts, whether markets, bathhouses, various things across large swathes of land. And it's the Silk Road in relation to theology, in that sense, contexts which can support. And this has always been, I would put this to myself when I was more beginning this journey, sort of 7-8 years ago. One of the desires was to be able to bring a certain quality of leader together in a context where they could actually engage with each other, because it's a context that's precisely not their third person home of authority. So you can't just come in and claim the same kind of authority. What is it to presence that? What is it to step into context? Well, it turns out there's an always already that will, of course, in some sense is more fundamental than whatever the particular cultivated symbolic order was that one presided over. Not to say it's not critical and important, but nevertheless, that seems to be so critical. The exemplification and the actual praxis of what could be contesting and competing authorities coming into relationship that might make possible a better treatment of the very ecology itself in terms of its flows and relationships and affordances and all this type of thing. So I'm curious how you relate to that. I have a tremendous interest in the framing of that project. I share a common interest in many regards. So I'm flagging that as somewhere where this does naturally unfold in terms of concrete project. And I'm curious if you see it that way and how you relate to it at the moment and all that.
I do, and I mean, one of the things about the Silk Road, of course, is it does actually traverse. I mean, the literal Silk Road did traverse through the actual homeland of shamanism, and so, and as you rightly pointed out, the shaman was very much. I mean, I think the argument that the shaman emerged when human beings dealt with ecological pressures by creating wider trading networks, and the shamans emerged as the liminal figures that could move between communities and in important ways. I think that's at least a plausible proposal. I see that as fundamentally what this is about. Let me try and articulate how that liminality. The point about the road, I used to use the metaphor of the courtyard rather than the courtroom. The road is basically the courtyard in open-ended extension. It's the idea that what is meant here is people can travel on that road. Nobody takes possession of it. It is owned as a through line in common, and people have various homes in it. You talked about symbolic communities. And people can leave their home and travel to another home. They can visit other homes and return and recover their home in a profound way. And there is no place that is the destination of the Silk Road. This isn't the attempt. This is a poesis. It's an attempt to give, an actual metaphor that taps into our deeper metaphors of paths and roads and orientation and movement and journey and pilgrimage, and say, well, can we take that and can we take the historical thing and can we abstract away from it and give this idea a new metaphor, a new picture that would allow people to actually enact, as you've been saying repeatedly, more concretely, but in a way that is the fostering of mutually transformative dialogos. And part of it is to remind people that religions, if we want to use a modern term that doesn't actually apply to a lot of human history, but let's use it just now as a convenient term. Religions are inherently synchronistic. They are inherently made out of gathering together and falling apart of other religions. They're very much like organic entities like that. Well, Christianity, yeah, what? Judaism was itself a syncretic emergence that then interacts with Platonism, that then interacts with the Roman, legal system. Like, stop pretending, right? And Judaism and Christianity was transformed, didn't become Christianity, but it was transformed in the face of Christianity. Some of that was violent. Let's hope we can leave the violence out. But right, and Christianity was transformed with the advent of Islam, and this is ongoing. And of course, I think the failure to recognize that is part of what's driving some of the really unfortunate violence in the world, but I won't get caught up in that right now. The point about the Silk Road is this idea of how can we properly prepare. I'm struggling, Tim. That's not even the right word. It's something more like prepare, the ancient notion of purification, not the modern sort of catharsis notion, but this ancient notion of getting into proper alignment for something, right? How can we prepare for the advent in a way that is mutually affording and mutually transformative without anybody claiming to mastery or ownership or authority over it? And what I've been trying to do is say, well, I'm going to sort of follow there was two lingua philosophica that arose. There was Neoplatonism and there was Zen, and there are these huge synoptic integrations that have periodically reached out and touched each other and interacted. The Kyoto School, and other things, and so Zen Neoplatonism as something that is inherently dialogical in nature, in which these two poles don't settle into the poles, but constantly undermine and challenge each other in an ongoing polarity, I think is something that could properly prepare for everybody and properly prepare everybody by giving them, a deep shared lingua philosophica by which they can do this flow that we've been talking about, messy into concrete, institutional into shamanic, that could be the best possible cross-cultural response to the advent of the sacred, so that it can address and heal the meaning crisis. That's the philosophical Silk Road.
Well, thank you, John, for expressing that. I know myself, whenever I'm asked about, things which require, what's that thing that's so important to you, to draw forth and attempt to express that. And you really do have to perform it in that sense of draw it forth poetically each time for it to be real in that way. So
totally. That's
I'm grateful for your energy.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I'm grateful for your energy. Now, my sense is that energetically, this has already been a very full 90 minutes. And so I'm just going to flag that. Yeah. Two notions that for me are in, an important kind of follow up here. One is membranes and the essentially like an ethics of participation in transgression, or at least mediating, navigating contact in that sense. That's been implicitly part of this dialogue in terms of a virtue of participation in the mess. And okay, so the other notion that I fold in is one of the things I've been attempting to communicate for the last few years. I haven't shared any writing on it. It's the relationship between holding space and sharing space, which I think is language I'm using because I think it's more accessible and really critical, because of course we hear about holding space so much in the context of transformative work and in the context of participating in community and various things. And it's absolutely critical. We do need to hold space for parts which require in that sense a protected context to cultivate relationship among themselves and to enter that whole making process. I'm not for a moment denying the criticality of holding space, nor that you and I here are not holding space in a critical sense, nor that in the context of a mediated or a mediating rather than maybe mediated interaction between religious traditions entering this dialogical process, that there is an important space to hold in that context. But the radicality of sharing space, again, in that second person praxis of ecology, the radicality of that sharing space is often what I've been pointing to as so central, because it's so important to remember, because in so much of what we're speaking about, as you said, that context for meeting cannot be owned in that traditional sense of holding within the confines of
Mm.
it doesn't even have to be a person. It's a prior fixed representation or sensibility regarding what even frequency is appropriate. And yet we cannot lose our dedication to contact with the ethical, virtuous transformation and participation in the transformation of that frequency, which might otherwise
Yeah.
challenge that previously held territory. And so it speaks to this precise paradox again. And in the context of the membranes and the transmission, this has been part of the voicecraft context a little bit. Alexander Bard will speak about this in relation to the Bard absolute. I am, in some important ways, skeptical of certainly how that can be formulated, and I'm uncertain about the poetry of Bard in its evoking of steel bars or something like this. There's something about that which evokes the image of a person with a key to let you in, rather than necessarily something that
Yeah.
participates in the contact, which is the movement between, let's say, some of these modes and domains we've been speaking about, which isn't to say there can't be resistance, which isn't to say there isn't appropriate protection, in even combat in some instances. And that may as well appear as though it is barred when you go to the football stadium and the game's playing, and you know that if you're going to run on there, you're violating something and people are
Yeah.
going to stop you, right? And membranes do have walls. Nevertheless, the poetry of how we relate to the participation in a, you could look at it as teacherly authority in welcoming in protecting the integrity, being in service to the integrity
Yeah.
of that fundamental context that makes possible holding space at all in some important sense. All of that is for me really on the pulse in a living way and an ongoing way at many levels. And I really appreciate the opportunity just to share with you, to check back in on how I'm relating to this on the path.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your effort and work in the world. And there's plenty of invitations I would love to invite and offer. I won't do that now, but just know that, I look forward to the opportunity to speak again with others in some context on many occasions, hopefully.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for your sensitivity. This is the end of the day for me, and my energy is starting to flag precisely because I have been very willingly, very enthusiastic about this dialogos we've been having. So I wanted to thank you for it. I think that tension about holding space and sharing space, and how do we get a semi-permeable membrane, because that's what a living membrane is, semi-permeable. And what does that mean? How do we cash that metaphor out? It's the right metaphor, but how do we cash it out in concrete, specific things we're doing? And those two overlap. This is Tillich's point about we're always caught between individuation and participation. We're always caught between integration and differentiation. I think the honesty about that, and the fact that we can't, like evolution itself, there is no final form of it. And I will often, and I do it intentionally to bring the very negative associations of the word. There is no final solution, and the honesty to stay in the fact that, well, here is where we stand now, because this is the optimal grip, to use some of my language, but that doesn't mean that that's where I should be standing, 2 days from now. And how to get that without being simply a dilettante or simply vacillating, that's the challenge, and it's And my hope is I'm going to be sort of talking about visiting 14 different thinkers who really wrestled with this, and hopefully by doing what Plato would call a multidimensional circumambulation that comes from both east and west, and probably end up in Samarkand, because I'm literally going to go to places as I do the series, and because I want the place, like we've been talking about, to really affect me, the geophilosophy. Right. I'm hoping that circumambulation will give me some better sense of the virtue, the virtuosity, the finesse that is needed to deal with that final point that you put your finger on. It is like it's the question that. Well, I'll just say what I said. First of all, it is a central question, and I think the first response that has to become more pervasive is just an honesty about that. And I don't mean a conceptual honesty, an admission of how one is personally torn, and how one has personally, because I am, and I have careened too far one way and too far the other. And if we could talk more about that, I don't mean do therapy with each other. I mean, be more honest about how that problem, that's not even the right word, that dilemma, I don't know what to call it, shows up, and share that. I think that would be at least an important first response to this issue about let's really get into the mess, as you've been calling it, and see what's there. I mean, my faith, and I use this word not as the sense of asserting belief without evidence, but the sense of an ongoing continuity of contact that reciprocally opens me with the world so that I come to love it more deeply. My faith is that even in the mess, there are through lines and weavings of intelligibility that will afford us orienting ourselves in a virtuous manner.
Yes, I believe that. That seems to be what happens.
Yes.
And it's just, sometimes it's just so difficult to open or wait or receive that orientation. And there really is a tonos that can become a tension that we can back away from. Beautiful. Well, I'll just, in closing, say geophilosophy is very exciting. In the Australian context, for so many years, I've attempted to, with care, approach the possibility of participating in the understanding associated with songlines.
Yes.
In the indigenous culture here.
Yes.
And so I thought I'd just let you know as well that that's sort of an area where I also meet with enthusiasm in the context of building and pilgrimage, and how the affordances of space and field for the possibility of, really is in participating in that mutuality of intelligence, where the words and the voice is really just one aspect of that broader plurality of that. And there's such an inspiring promise in all of that. And so good luck, and I look forward to being in relation to that to the degree possible. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been a great pleasure. Joy.